He's about to watch a man beg for his life, and the crowd around him doesn't even blink. Dodzz is jammed into a stone bench inside the Colosseum, 50,000 Romans screaming around him loud enough to feel it in his chest. Down on the sand, one gladiator is on his knees, shield dropped, one finger raised toward the crowd. Dodzz turns to the man next to him, mouth already open to ask what happens next. And the guy just watches, completely calm, like he's seen this exact moment 100 times before. So here's the question everyone assumes they already know the answer to. Did Romans really pay money, take the day off work, and pack a 50,000-seat stadium just to watch other human beings die? For fun? The honest answer is more complicated than yes or no. And the reason it's complicated is that we've been mentally merging three completely different things that happened in that arena into one single bloody event. Gladiators fighting for their lives, wild animals hunted for spectacle, and condemned criminals executed in public. Rome kept these separate. We don't. And that mix-up is the whole reason this question feels so much darker and so much stranger than the reality actually was. Let's start with where this even came from, because it's not where you'd guess. The first recorded gladiator fight in Rome wasn't public entertainment at all. It happened in 264 BC, at the funeral of a nobleman named Junius Brutus Para. His sons organized 3 pairs of fighters to duel, right there at the grave in his honor. This wasn't a show. It was a debt. The Latin word for these events, munus, literally means duty or obligation, something owed to the dead. Many historians trace the custom back further, to Etruscan or Campanian funeral rites, where blood spilled at a grave was believed to appease the spirit of the deceased. In other words, gladiators didn't start as entertainers. They started as a religious offering, a kind of blood tribute paid on behalf of a dead man's family, to a dead man's spirit. That's the assumption a modern person gets wrong immediately. This wasn't invented as a form of fun. It was invented as a funeral rite that happened to involve combat. And for a long time, that's genuinely all it was. Small, private, tied to a specific grave, a specific grieving family. No stadium, no ticket, no crowd of strangers. Just 3 pairs of fighters, a burial, and a debt being paid to a dead man's memory in the oldest currency Rome had: blood. So how did a private grief ritual, held for one dead aristocrat at a time, turn into the biggest public spectacle in the ancient world? Money. Specifically, political money. Funding one of these funeral duels became a way to publicly display your family's wealth and status. So the fights got bigger. In 216 BC, 22 pairs of gladiators fought at one nobleman's funeral. Decades later, when Julius Caesar held games to honor his own father, who had died 20 years earlier, he brought out over 300 pairs of gladiators dressed in silvered armor. A number so large that the Roman Senate, still nervous about the Spartacus slave revolt, actually passed a law limiting how many gladiators one person could keep in the city. By the late Republic, the religious function had mostly faded into the background, and something much more useful to ambitious politicians had taken over. If you wanted the Roman public to like you, to vote for you, to remember your name, hosting spectacular games was one of the most effective tools available. It became less about honoring the dead, and much more about buying popularity from the living. By the time we reach the imperial period, the scale is almost hard to picture. When Emperor Titus formally opened the Colosseum in 80 AD, the celebration reportedly ran for 100 days straight. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing decades later, described thousands of animals being killed during the festivities. A staggering display meant to announce, in the most visible way possible, that this emperor could command the resources of the entire known world and simply spend them on spectacle. Some emperors went further still. There are accounts of the Colosseum's arena floor being flooded to stage Namakii, miniature naval battles, complete with actual ships and crews, rest-staged for an audience that had never seen the ocean. Here's a detail that might surprise you, though. These weren't the chaotic bloodbaths you're picturing. By the 1st century AD, gladiator combat had rules. Real ones. A referee called the Summa Rudis stood in the arena during matches, carrying a staff, with the authority to stop a fight the moment it became one-sided or dangerously uneven. If a gladiator was losing badly or clearly outmatched, he could drop his shield and raise a single finger, a formal request for missio, mercy. That request went to the sponsor of the games, sometimes to the emperor himself, who typically read the mood of the crowd before making the call. And the survival numbers back this up in a way most people find genuinely shocking. Based on inscriptions, tomb records, and painted results from Pompeii, historians estimate that in the 1st century AD, a gladiator had roughly a 1 in 10 chance of dying in any single match. If he lost and mercy was requested, somewhere around 80% of the time, mercy was granted. Think about what that actually means. Most gladiators who lost a fight walked out of that arena alive. Why? Because gladiators were expensive. A trained fighter represented years of investment, housing, food, weapons training, medical care, all paid for by a lanista, essentially a talent manager who rented gladiators out to whoever was hosting the games. If your prize fighter died every time he lost, your entire business model collapses in about 1 season. So a good gladiator, one who fought skillfully even in defeat, was often worth more alive than dead. Some of the most successful ones became something very close to modern athletic celebrities. Their names scratched into walls by fans, their win records tracked and remembered, women reportedly seeking them out despite their legally disgraced social status. Walls in Pompeii still carry some of that fan culture, preserved by volcanic ash for us to read 2,000 years later. Graffiti scratched by ordinary Romans records individual gladiators by name, along with running tallies of their fights and wins, the same instinct that makes a modern fan track a boxer's career record. One particularly well-known piece of wall graffiti calls a gladiator named Celadus something close to the girl's heartthrob. A nickname, not a eulogy. You don't write nicknames like that for men you expect to be dead by next season. And that status sits inside a genuinely strange contradiction. Legally, gladiators were classified as infames, a category that also included actors and prostitutes, people formally excluded from full citizenship and social respectability. And yet, simultaneously, some of the most successful ones were treated as something close to superstars. Rome could look down on a profession and worship its top performers at exactly the same time. That contradiction, oddly enough, is not hard for a modern audience to understand at all. Dodzz watches the referee step between the two fighters and physically separate them mid-swing with his staff. He blinks. Okay, so there's a ref. There are rules. There's mercy. This is starting to look a lot less like a massacre and a lot more like a really intense, really dangerous sport. But here's where we have to be careful, because that description, dangerous sport with rules and mercy, does not cover everything that happened in a Roman arena on game day. A full day at the games, in the imperial period, typically had 3 distinct acts, and Romans understood them as 3 completely different kinds of events, even though modern retellings usually blur them into one long bloodbath. The morning was the venatio, the beast hunt. Trained hunters, called venators, fought and killed wild animals imported from across the empire: lions, leopards, bears, even elephants and rhinoceroses on rare occasions. Partly as a display of exotic spectacle, and partly as a literal demonstration of Rome's power to command and conquer the natural world, all the way to its farthest provinces. Midday was something else entirely. This was when condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and enemies of the state were formally executed, sometimes by exposure to wild animals, a practice known as damnatio ad bestias. This wasn't combat in any real sense. These people had no weapons, no training, no chance, and no missio. This was the Roman legal system carrying out capital punishment in public as spectacle. The Roman writer Seneca described attending the midday executions and finding them genuinely disturbing. Not thrilling, not entertaining, but grim enough that he wrote about walking away from them unsettled, using the experience as a warning about the corrupting effect of crowds. Only in the afternoon did the actual gladiator matches take place, the ones with the referee, the rules, the trained professionals, the missio, and the roughly 90% survival rate per bout. There's one emperor who blurs this entire structure in a way historians still find almost hard to believe. Commodus, who ruled in the late 2nd century AD. Rather than simply sponsoring games from the imperial box like every emperor before him, Commodus reportedly entered the arena himself, fighting as a gladiator, and by Roman accounts he made sure his opponents were poorly matched or already wounded before he faced them. He also staged himself killing exotic animals from a raised platform at a safe, guaranteed distance. Ancient historians treated this as scandalous, almost insane behavior for an emperor. Not because fighting in the arena was shameful for a gladiator, but because it was deeply beneath the dignity of the man who was supposed to be sitting above the entire system, safely watching it happen to other people. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. The event most associated in our minds with Romans watching people die for fun, actual guaranteed no-chance death, wasn't the gladiators at all. It was the midday executions. The part of the show built around real, certain killing was a punishment, not a sport, and by multiple ancient accounts it wasn't even the crowd favorite. Some sources suggest the midday executions had a smaller, thinner audience than the morning beast hunts or the afternoon gladiator matches. Many spectators reportedly left for lunch and came back later, treating the executions almost as an intermission rather than the main event. That doesn't mean nobody watched, or that it wasn't brutal, or that Romans found it morally troubling in any organized way. It just means the part of the day that involved certain death was, for a meaningful portion of the audience, apparently the least compelling part of the show, not the most. Seneca's account is worth sitting with a little longer, because it's one of the few times we hear a Roman voice openly uneasy about what he'd just watched. Writing to a friend, he described going to the arena expecting light relief between the morning hunts and the afternoon matches, and instead finding only executions. Men with no weapons, no training, no chance, forced into the sand simply to die in front of a crowd for the crime of having already been condemned. He didn't frame it as thrilling. He framed it as something closer to a warning, an example of how easily a crowd's presence could erode a person's own sense of decency, simply by being swept along with everyone else watching. There was one genuine exception where gladiators themselves faced guaranteed death, and it's worth naming so the picture stays honest. Certain games, particularly in the earlier Republican period and tied to specific funeral or political contexts, were staged as munera sine missione, fights without release, where no mercy was permitted and only one combatant was meant to walk out alive. These events were rarer than popular imagination assumes, and by the early imperial period they'd become uncommon enough that some emperors reportedly restricted or banned them outright, precisely because they undercut the economics and the showmanship of the sport everyone actually wanted to watch. Meanwhile, the part everyone actually showed up for, the gladiator duels, was closer to a heavily regulated, extremely dangerous professional sport than a killing floor. Skilled, trained fighters, valuable enough to protect, competing under rules with a real chance of walking away, cheered on very much the way a modern crowd cheers on a boxer or an MMA fighter today. So the actual specific answer to why did Romans pay to watch people die for fun is this: mostly they didn't. Not in the way the question assumes. What they paid for was three very different things bundled into one long day. An exotic wildlife spectacle in the morning, a genuinely dangerous but heavily rule-bound athletic contest in the afternoon that most participants survived, and, separately, in between, the public enforcement of Roman law against people the state had already condemned to die. Only that middle piece was really watching people die in the way we picture it today, and it was closer to a public execution than to entertainment as Rome itself seemed to understand the word. The gladiators, the part of the games that actually earned the crowd's obsession, their graffiti, their fan following, their legendary status, were prized specifically because they usually didn't die. Rome built an entire industry around keeping its most popular fighters alive, fight after fight, because a dead champion was a wasted investment and an empty seat next week. To be honest with you, we don't have gladiators' own voices in the historical record. No diaries, no first-hand accounts from the men actually fighting for their lives in that sand. Almost everything we know comes from the Romans watching, funding, or writing about them from the stands, which means we're reconstructing how it actually felt to fight from the outside looking in, and there are limits to what that can tell us. Dodzz is standing just outside the arena wall now, watching a small crowd cluster around a gladiator's name freshly scratched into the stone. A fan, apparently, leaving graffiti the way you'd carve initials into a stadium seat. He tilts his head, watch swinging gently on its strap. So the guy risking his life down there might actually be more famous and better protected than half the senators watching him. Rome. Never quite what you expect. Here's what I think is actually worth sitting with. Rome didn't invent the idea of paying to watch danger. We still do that constantly. We fill stadiums for boxing and MMA, sports built entirely around two people trying to physically hurt each other under an agreed set of rules, with a referee standing by to stop it before it goes too far. We still separate that instinctively and completely from an execution. We understand, without anyone teaching us, that a boxing match and a death sentence carried out in public are not the same category of event, even if both technically involve violence in front of an audience. Rome drew that same line. It just drew it in a stadium that also happened to host actual public executions on the same afternoon, which makes the line a lot harder for us, 2,000 years later, to see clearly. But the Romans in those stands could see it. They knew exactly which part of the day was sport, and which part was punishment, even if we've since let those two things blur together into one single, simpler, darker story. Maybe that's the real through line here. The urge to watch controlled danger, skill under pressure, someone risking real physical harm on our behalf while we sit safely in the stands, that hasn't gone anywhere in 2,000 years. We just built better rules around it, kept it separate from actual capital punishment, and mostly stopped mixing our sports arenas with our courtrooms. The fighters even get to walk away rich and famous now instead of merely alive, which, if you think about it, is Rome's own gladiator economy, just with better contracts. If stories like this, the ones where the real history turns out to be stranger and more specific than the version you already believed, are your thing, subscribe, because Dodzz still has 6 more civilizations to walk through, and every one of them has a moment exactly like this hiding in it. Tell me in the comments, what's one? Everybody knows this historical fact you'd want Dodzz to actually fact-check next.